Welcome back to the Lane Report. In this presentation, we discuss the role Alfred Mahan played in the creation of an American empire in the Pacific Ocean and beyond. During the same period that Halford Mackinder was developing his geopolitical theory, specifically focusing on the strategic value of the Eurasian landmass, another individual was building his own theory on the strategic importance of water. In 1890, Alfred Thayer Mahan was a lecturer in naval history and the president of the U.S. Naval War College when he published The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, a dry but extensive exposé on the history and importance of naval power as a factor in the rise of the British Empire between 1660 and 1783. Mahan's book was hardly a page-turner, but it had one very important argument. With land becoming scarce, the sea was the next frontier. His thesis was largely dependent on the value of international and maritime trade as a major factor in determining the wealth of nations. He argued that it was only natural that major European powers competed for control over maritime trade routes. In his first paragraph, he presents this claim quite clearly. Quote, "The history of sea power is largely a narrative of contests between nations, of mutual rivalries, of violence frequently culminating in war. The profound influence of sea commerce upon the wealth and the strength of countries was clearly seen long before the true principles which governed its growth and prosperity were detected. To secure one's own people a disproportionate share of such benefits, every effort was made to exclude others, either by the peaceful legislative methods of monopoly or prohibitory regulations, or, when these failed, by direct violence." As expressed in this paragraph, Mahan was a proponent of vigorous foreign policy. In other words, he argued that countries such as the United States would be unable to absorb the massive amounts of industrial and commercial goods being produced domestically. In order to avoid economic collapse, he proposed that the United States should seek new markets abroad. What concerned Mahan most was ensuring that the U.S. government could guarantee access to these new international markets. Securing such access would require three things: a merchant navy, which could carry American products to new markets across the great highway of the high seas, an American battleship navy to deter or destroy rival fleets, a network of naval bases capable of providing fuel and supplies for the enlarged navy, and maintaining open lines of communications between the United States and its new markets. Immediately after the publication of his book, Mahan gained the support of U.S. Naval officer and Civil Service Commissioner Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt had recently returned from the Dakota Territory when he was appointed to the Civil Service Commission. While on vacation, Roosevelt read Mahan's work and immediately wrote him a letter complimenting him on his analysis of naval power. In his letter, Roosevelt tells Mahan, quote, "During the last 2 days I have spent half my time, busy as I am, in reading your book, and that I found it interesting is shown by the fact that having taken it up, I have gone straight through and finished it. It is a very good book, admirable, and I am greatly in error if it does not become a naval classic." Of course, to Roosevelt, it was more than just a naval classic. It was a playbook for a dynamic country that had just encountered the limits to its growth in the West. Mahan's book would become Roosevelt's strategy for building the American empire. After his appointment as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy by William McKinley, he invited Mahan to the Naval War College quite often. Mahan gave lectures and helped write Roosevelt's speeches. This close relationship resulted in the annexation of Hawaii during his tenure. Not concerned with economic growth as a primary driver of public policy, Roosevelt focused on building a naval empire. He expressed concerns over the growth of Japan in the Pacific and turned his attention to the annexation of island territory. During his time as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Roosevelt oversaw the expansion of U.S. territory across the Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean. He had long supported the annexation of islands as strategic naval bases, but Spain was standing in his way. Roosevelt needed an excuse to take control of Spanish territory, but McKinley was not interested in war with a European power. In early 1898, Assistant Secretary Roosevelt would get the excuse he needed. The USS Maine was stationed in Havana Harbor after Spain warned the U.S. to stay out of its territorial waters. On February 15th, the forward hull of the Maine exploded in a devastating blast and was sunk. 266 of the 355 sailors on board were killed. Close friends and allies with Roosevelt, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, quickly began publishing articles calling for war with Spain. The U.S. declared war on Spain on April 25th, but the war would only last for 3.5 months. Several island territories such as Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines were ceded to the United States as a result of the war. Interestingly, subsequent investigations by the Navy did not provide clear evidence as to what caused the explosion on the Maine. Initially, it was thought that a mine in Havana Harbor caused the explosion, but some investigators argue it was more likely the combustion of coal near munitions that caused the explosion. According to Ambassador Daniel Benjamin and Professor Stephen Simon, evidence suggested that the explosion occurred on the inside of the ship rather than the outside. To this day, Spain has not claimed responsibility for the explosion, and no evidence has been provided to show otherwise. After becoming president in 1901, Roosevelt continued using Mahan as an advisor and implementing his philosophies in foreign policy. While giving a speech at the Minnesota State Fair in Falcon Heights, Minnesota, Roosevelt told a crowd of people, quote, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," referring specifically to his foreign policy. In a letter to a close friend, Roosevelt claimed this was his favorite African proverb and could prove useful against the Japanese in the Pacific. His public statements later became known as the Big Stick Diplomacy and was used by Roosevelt to build the Panama Canal, expand influence in Cuba, and build a world-class navy. While speaking softly was an important aspect of his philosophy, he placed more emphasis on the big stick approach to diplomacy. It would be Mahan's influence and friendship that would help to define Roosevelt's philosophies on imperial expansion. Of course, Roosevelt's approach to imperial expansion was nothing novel. The U.S. had been expanding its presence in the Pacific since the late 1850s. A series of climate changes and an agricultural revolution in the Great Plains had resulted in growing demand for industrial fertilizers. It would be the growing demand for bird guano that would be the first push for an American empire.
The Guano Islands are a really important part of this story as well. Can you talk about what they are, what they were used for, and how did they become kind of the legal basis of U.S. empire?
Yeah, so it's important to recognize that the U.S. empire includes large colonies, but it also includes a lot of islands, and some of them can be quite small and some of them unpopulated. In fact, that's the start of the United States' overseas empire. So the history of U.S. expansion is a history of a set of conquests and annexations in the North American continent that terminate in 1854 with the Gadsden Purchase, just a little sliver of land on the U.S.-Mexican border that fills out the familiar silhouette of the United States, that fills out that profile. 3 years later, when the United States expands overseas, it starts claiming uninhabited islands. And the reason it does so is really interesting. The reason it starts claiming islands is that it is seeking what is on those islands. It is seeking guano. In this case, the United States is having an agricultural crisis as it's transitioned to industrial agriculture. And one of the things that works really well to save these farms, and these farms are a huge part of the U.S. economy, is seabird droppings from islands, relatively rainless islands in the Caribbean or the Pacific. At the behest of U.S. farmers, the United States just seeks out as many of these islands, uninhabited islands, as it can find, ultimately claiming nearly 100 in the latter half of the 19th century. And these become the first overseas holdings that the United States has. And it's really interesting because, up until then, the United States had always argued about, should we take, Louisiana Purchase, how much of Mexico, et cetera, et cetera. Here, there's just a single law. It's called the Guano Islands Act, and it says that any uninhabited islands that anyone sees that has guano on it can be annexed to the United States, and it will be considered as appertaining to the country. And there's just a sort of quick formal process, and boom, this island is suddenly part of the United States. And there's a Supreme Court case about this, so there's a question about the constitutionality, but the Supreme Court signs off on it, and ultimately this becomes the legal basis for a much larger and enduring U.S. overseas empire, because just that little phrase, these islands will be considered as appertaining to the United States, that just gives away the game because suddenly the United States can expand overseas. And it is precisely on this legal precedent that the United States takes far larger colonies like the Philippines.
Then we get to World War II, Daniel, which is interesting because your book actually begins with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the event that was used to justify U.S. involvement in the war. Talk about what happened and its significance.
There are 3 dates in U.S. history that most people in the country know. So they know July 4th, 1776, the signing of the Declaration of Independence. They know September 11th, 2001. And they also know December 7th, 1841, the date which will live in infamy when, if you ask most people what happened on that day, they will say that's when Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was at that point in the territory of Hawaii. And that event has become such a constitutive part of national history, of national myth. There are movies made about it. But what those movies rarely show is what happens next. Because Japan didn't just attack the territory of Hawaii. This was part of a intended to be simultaneous sort of all-empire attack where within a matter of hours, Japan attacked Hawaii, Wake Islands, Guam, and the largest territory that the United States ever held, the Philippines. It also attacked the British territories of Hong Kong and Malaya and the independent kingdom of Thailand. I mean, the whole point of this was that Japan was trying to sweep the leg of European and Anglophone empires in order to get room to expand within the Pacific. So, militarily, the damage done to the Philippines was arguably just as bad as the damage done to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And, people didn't know how to talk about this. They didn't know how to refer to what had just happened. We have a term for it, Pearl Harbor, but that term wasn't available at the time. It's not until a couple days later that you start hearing descriptions of the event as Pearl Harbor. So, if you see newspapers that are, composed within hours of this, they'll say things like, Japan attacked Guam and Hawaii, or Japan attacked Hawaii and the Philippines. That's also exactly how FDR describes it in the first draft of his Date Which Will Live in Infamy speech. It's an attack on Hawaii and the Philippines. And then he changes his description of the main target. So this event is no longer narrated as an attack on these 2 large colonies, Hawaii and the Philippines. It's now an attack on the territory of Hawaii specifically. And now you have this question, why? Why did FDR change how he was narrating the target of the attack? He still mentioned the Philippines, but nevertheless, FDR clearly focused the attention of his audience on Hawaii. Even Hawaii was a little wobbly. It's a territory like the Philippines and Guam, but it has a larger white population, and that made it easier for people in the United States to imagine it as part of the United States. But Fortune magazine did a survey in 1940 asking its readers, would they support a defense of Hawaii? And its readers, barely a majority of them said yes. So you can see that FDR not only doesn't want to test his audience with the Philippines, but is even worried about Hawaii too. The last edit he makes to the speech, between the last paper draft that we have and the spoken version that he delivered, he makes a final edit, and he inserts the word American before his description of the target. So that Japan didn't attack the island of Oahu, it attacked the American island of Oahu. And FDR, you can see him just sort of pushing that a little bit, just trying to round Hawaii up to American in the eyes of his audience so that he can deliver a clear story. The Empire of Japan attacked the United States of America, and it's time for war.
On this show, we often reference the U.S. dropping the nuclear bombs on Japan as kind of a really important moment for the U.S. empire to assert itself as the world power, kind of installing a new world order, as you can say. But at the same time, your book explains that the U.S. was kind of distancing itself from its colonial territories. The Philippines had gained independence, Alaska, Hawaii became states. Why shed power at the same time it had gained so much?
Yeah, so it's really interesting what the United States does, because up until largely World War II, the pattern had been when countries get more powerful, they get larger. They just seize more territory. That's what the British Empire had done. That's what its predecessors had done. And the United States, at the end of World War II, is kind of in an extraordinary position. It has atomic bombs. No one else has them. It has extraordinarily strong military. It has a system of bases that extend all over the planet. And it also has claims, either as colonies or more largely as occupied territories, quite a lot of people. So if you actually look at all of the lands that the United States has outside of the mainland, all of the places over which it exerts jurisdiction, all the places where the Stars and Stripes flies, you see that actually the United States controls more people outside of the states than in. There's a larger population beyond the mainland than there is in the mainland. There's a larger population outside of the states than in the states. And so that raises a really interesting question. Why didn't the United States double down? Why didn't it start going on an imperial shopping spree, doing what Britain would have done in the 19th century? And I think there are two answers to that question. One answer is anti-imperial resistance. Colonized people throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century have been gathering force, organizing, and after World War II, getting armed. They drove the cost of colonialism up. It was harder to take colonies, especially new colonies, after 1945 than it had been in, say, 1850. And there's another part of the story, too. At the same time, the United States had gotten really good in World War II at what I call empire-killing technologies, ways of projecting force across borders, projecting influence across borders, rather than by trying to claim influence by extending borders, i.e. by taking new territory. And so those empire-killing technologies drove the demand for colonies down. And the combination of those two things, anti-imperial revolt and new technologies, making it easier for the United States to do what it wanted without claiming large colonies, that resulted in a new footprint of power where the United States didn't seek large populated territories, but just sought instead dots, just military bases, hundreds of them, in fact, spread out all over the world, just these little small enclaves through which it could move its men, project its force and influence, and control much of the planet.
Mahan's influence in foreign policy did not stop with the United States. He held regular meetings with Queen Victoria and Kaiser Wilhelm II to discuss naval strategy. His impact on Kaiser Wilhelm was so profound that Mahan's book became required reading for German naval officers. At the beginning of the 20th century, his book was translated into Japanese and became required reading for Japanese naval officers throughout World War II. Mahan's research still has a major impact on research and policy today. As of 2017, around 75% of global trade by volume occurs at sea. This has resulted in maritime dependency as a predictor of per capita wealth. According to a study published in Marine Policy by J.M. Lane and Michael Predis, quote, "Today as much as 75% of international trade takes place over water due to the fuel efficiency of seaborne freight and worldwide dependency on water as a means for transportation. Issues in economic geography, such as being landlocked and maritime trade, are directly related to global development patterns. A country's ability to participate in international trade and transport goods overseas is integral in the modern global economy." In many ways, Mahan's thesis on sea power inspired the growth of maritime transportation and naval power over the past century. Viewed as the unofficial imperial handbook of the United States, Mahan's thesis would be adopted by the People's Republic of China in the latter half of the 20th century. According to the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, there are approximately 3,700 active deep-water ports around the world. These ports dot the landscape, contributing 11.08 billion tons of cargo in 2019 alone. The proportion of ports per country is indicative of Mahan's research. Today, the United States leads port infrastructure development with a total of 552 seaports, and the United Kingdom is in a distant second with just 391. However, increased efficiency in Asian ports and a growing number of ports in China has resulted in competition between East Asian economies and the United States for supremacy in the Pacific. Tensions have increased in the past decades between the U.S. and China over control of trade in the Pacific, leading to growing concerns among policy analysts. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development has warned that these tensions could result in further complications in maritime trade and have the potential to result in open conflict. Shipping routes in Southeast Asia are of particular concern among experts in maritime trade. The Southeast Asian region is strategically located at the crossing of the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. The region is home to important oceans, seas, and straits that formed one of the busiest international sea lines of communication. The South China Sea and the Strait of Malacca play a vital role in international trade and are considered choke points in maritime shipping lanes. Today, Asian container trade accounts for almost 60% of the share of the world container throughput, with East Asia as the dominant subregion, while Singapore and Malaysia are the best connected ports in Southeast Asia via the Strait of Malacca. For this reason, the U.S. and European Union have been paying close attention to recent moves by China in the South China Sea. Currently, the U.S. has a strategic advantage over China in the Western Pacific. However, U.S. allies have expressed concerns over the construction of naval bases by China on the Spratly Islands. Disagreements over the Spratly Islands, located in the South China Sea between Vietnam, China, Philippines, Brunei, and Malaysia, began in the late 1960s after the discovery of oil. Conflict seemed imminent when, in 2009, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei submitted claims to the United Nations concerning several of the islands. China immediately warned the UN to ignore these submissions because they considered these islands Chinese sovereign territory. In 2016, the Philippines submitted a request to the UN for arbitration over economic exclusive rights provided to them by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. They claimed that the convention gave them exclusive rights to the oil surrounding several of the Spratly Islands, but China refused to attend the arbitration. The court ruled in favor of the Philippines, but China has ignored the ruling. Unknown to most of the world at the time, China had been constructing naval bases and airfields on several of the smaller atolls. They had transported sand from beneath the ocean and expanded the size of several of these islands to make room for military installations. By the end of 2016, 3 new naval airfields had been installed on Fiery Cross Reef, Subi Reef, and Mischief Reef Islands. Relations between the Philippines and China over these naval bases had become so contentious that in 2016, when Rodrigo Duterte was campaigning for the presidency, he said, quote, "I will ride a jet ski to the Spratly Islands while bringing the Philippine flag. I would say to China, do not claim anything here, and I will not insist also that it is ours. But then I will just keep a blind eye." 1 year after his election, Duterte ordered troops to occupy several uninhabited islands in the Spratly chain he claimed were Philippine sovereign territory. He stated to the international press that he was planning to send military to several of the larger islands that the Philippines claimed as territory. In April 2019, China sent nearly 300 naval vessels to the island of Pagasa, an atoll called Thitu Island by the Chinese and claimed by both countries. The Philippine Department of Foreign Affairs issued a public statement saying that they would take appropriate action, declaring that such actions were illegal and clear violations of Philippine sovereignty, sovereign rights, and jurisdiction as defined under international law. Shortly after these comments, Duterte met with U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to discuss possible solutions to the issue. The Trump administration agreed to conduct freedom of navigation operations more regularly in the South China Seas. However, this increasingly confrontational stance has led to concerns in Southeast Asia that the risk of conflict between China and the United States is increasing, particularly as ASEAN attempts to establish a code of conduct with China on the South China Sea. To this day, the U.S. continues to apply the lessons learned from Alfred T. Mahan, taught to Theodore Roosevelt from a century ago. Next time on the Lane Report, we discuss how Samuel P. Huntington's Clash of Civilization thesis was used by political power brokers to create a perpetual war on terror.